Hello and welcome to A Friend Remembers retrospective of Final Fantasy, all the mainline numbered games in the series. Here we look at and ask the question why you should play Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX is the third game of the PlayStation 1 trilogy of Final Fantasy main numbered games, which is the third console generation that the series had shown up in, and was made with the 10th game already pretty heavily and far through pre-production, as they announced the game already looking ahead and saying where we're going to go into the next console generation on the PlayStation 2. That doesn't mean it's worth overlooking. Final Fantasy IX, more than any other game in the series, looks backwards and says, what inspiration can we draw from what's come before, and how can we tie all of this crazy mess together? It's the last mainline entry to use the active time battle system that had been around all the way back to Final Fantasy IV, although it's been heavily refined since then. The critics of Final Fantasy IX would say this is a game that's incredibly slow in its combat. I do understand where they're coming from. The battle speed is not as fast as several of the other games, and most critically of all, there's a long queuing system where between you telling the characters what action you want to take, they queue up and pause and have a cooldown before they actually initiate said action. It can be quite frustrating when you have all of your characters on the screen standing there waiting to take an action, and by the time one of them moves, their cooldown bar that's visible to you, the active time gauge, is pretty much refilled before any other character has actually taken their turn. This does slow down the pace of battle. On the flip side, this isn't necessarily a negative, it allows you to think much more tactically. Final Fantasy IX restores the system to having 4 playable characters for the first time since the series was a 2-dimensional pixel-based game, and it really opens up your opportunities. It does fall into the trap that I didn't like in some of the early games, that you have set characters and one is a designated healer, one is a designated damage dealer, which means you're not so much thinking tactically about how you respond to a situation, you're thinking tactically about what the capabilities of an individual character are and what they're anticipated to be needed to do several turns ahead. This is a slight adjustment in mindset, but once you get behind it, there's a lot to adore in the combat system of Final Fantasy IX. What I really can't stand though is the loading times. This game was so advanced. When you compare it to Final Fantasy VII, the first 3-dimensional game, it's night and day how beautiful this game looks. The world is so much more vibrant, it's so much more open. Squaresoft had really become much more confident in their 3-dimensional rendering techniques. They could render outdoor, 3-dimensional, wild, extravagant situations, and the characters all blend into that scenery much more naturally. The enemies are more detailed and they move much more fluidly. The downside of this is between you stumbling across a random battle on the world map and the combat actually initiating, there's a very long pause for loading times, and none of the ports of this game to modern consoles have resolved this problem. That loading time is probably the only negative I can sell you on though. The storyline of Final Fantasy IX is right up there with the best in the series, with the one downside being that lots of elements of it hark back to what's been seen before. The core plot of Final Fantasy IX is pretty solid in itself. It stars a small group of protagonists who kidnap a princess from a war tyrant queen who is intent on taking over the world. She is being manipulated by an evil sorcerer who is his own reasons for trying to initiate this civil war across the continent, and this sorcerer is himself being played by godlike maniacal figures from another world who plan to tear down and remake the world in their image using the power of the magical crystals. All of these elements have been seen before, but Final Fantasy IX does weave something incredibly new out of that experience and makes it feel fresh, makes it feel vibrant, and that is nowhere more obvious than the characters. Zidane is almost an exact refusal to engage in the tropes that the last 2 games in the series. He's not a moody teenager, he's a bright and vibrant lead character, potentially a little bit problematic in the way he treats women, but that's beautifully flipped on its head when one of the younger female characters in the game develops a crush on him and he realises, actually I'm a little bit of a douchebag, I shouldn't treat people like this. But Zidane is smart, he's witty, he loves life, and although he goes through a little character crisis towards the end of the game when revelations about his past are brought out, it's brushed over pretty quickly, but that doesn't feel negative, it feels earned from the delight and the love he's built for the characters around him. These characters, this is the first game in the series since Final Fantasy IV where there's actual strife and conflict between the characters. Zidane has his own troop. He starts off as a member of a gang come to kidnap the princess, falls in love with her and follows her around the world. He teams up with Vivi, a black mage who is going through his own existential crisis, and is quickly pulled into this war which threatens to destroy the continent. Meanwhile, Princess Garnet has her own bodyguard Steiner. They have their own motives, and the story will quite regularly shuffle players in and out of your party depending on where you are on the storyline. This can feel quite intrusive across the first 3 discs, which is almost 80% of the game. It's not until the very end where you pretty much have complete freedom about who you want to prioritise. Not all of the characters in this game are quite as strong as the core 4, however. Whilst Zidane, Vivi, Daggett and Steiner are excellent characters, there are a few such as Amaranth or Quina who leave a lot to be desired. But the storyline makes sure to bring everyone into the game at one point or another and make sure everyone has their moment in the sun before you're given free rein to remove the people you don't care about at the end of the game. If you don't mind losing that freedom, Final Fantasy IX offers a beautifully paced experience where your characters are extremely customizable. You learn abilities by equipping different armor or weapons, so whilst you could just equip the strongest armor and the strongest weapons, it's often useful to put weaker armor and prioritize learning a new spell or new technique that your characters didn't have before. This trade-off between the characters being at peak capability or banking that risk for future potential is a beautiful system, although it does mean you're micromanaging your equipment pretty constantly throughout the adventure. The music is bright and vibrant, and this is the last game that Nobuo Uematsu pretty much entirely solo composed, and he was clearly having a whale of a time, bringing all sorts of Celtic influences into display here. Some people would say that the main villain in this piece, the sorcerer Kuja, is potentially a weak link. Kuja clearly is riffing off Kefka from Final Fantasy VI, but in a much more melancholy and less dramatic way. That is potentially to the game's detriment, but I honestly can't fault what was going on here. Final Fantasy IX is one of the most polished entries in the series. The core storyline will pull you through from start to finish, slowly unravelling its layers, each disc introducing a new deeper layer to the threat. What starts as a civil war turns into an existential philosophical nightmare about the creation and rewriting and unravelling and death of all of a fantasy reality. Where it struggles perhaps though is the side quests and minigames. Following on from Final Fantasy VII and VIII, the minigames of Final Fantasy IX are, at least they're not intrusive. You very rarely have to partake in them for very long. Most of them are one and done. Once you've seen them, they then become optional for higher level equipment and abilities, and some of them you can even have multiple different ways of getting that equipment. If you want to not engage with the minigame, you can pursue achieving it another way. But games like Chocobo Hot and Cold are just interminably slow and require a lot of effort and time to get the high rewards that are possible at the end of the game, but potentially not worth your time depending on your patience. The Mog Quest side plot, where you have to collect letters for the Moogles scattered across the game, is a really interesting idea with a good payoff at the end. However, you can't revisit a lot of the areas you progress through for the main story, so the Moogles that you would be searching for, if you miss one, if you forget to deliver a letter, or if you forget to collect one at a certain part in the game, you're locked out and you can't go back. The card game is a pale imitation of what was there in Final Fantasy VIII and far more irritating, but also fortunately far less involved in the game's core narrative. One of the experimental things that I think did pay off was because Zidane comes from another gang. When you start the game, he's a member of the thieves gang Tantalus. He has his own boss and gang leader and his own comrades who are with him on this adventure. You get separated from them very early on, but there's a fairly optional ability when you're watching various points of the games to see an optional cutscene to find out what's been going on with Tantalus and keep tabs on other characters who are not in your core party. This is a really nice way of placing out the plot. If you're not that interested or engaged in certain sub-characters, you can ignore watching their cutscenes, but for those of us who like to get a complete sense of what's going on, I was delighted by just how involved this entire side quest was and what was going on with this secondary set of characters who, whilst not core to the main storyline, really flesh out the world of Final Fantasy IX and pull you in and get you engaged in wanting to save this pretty precious place. Zidane and Vivi's storyline use the same thematic concepts. Their storylines are both about the power of creation, of life and death in this fantasy world. Vivi is an artificial being, He was made by people who were out to commit acts of war and genocide. Is he a weapon, or is he an individual with his own true character? Despite being one of the most stereotypically simple characters in the series, basically just the character being a costume from the very original game, his personality, his innocence and childlike viewpoint of the world, watching it get trashed and tarnished, watching him find other black mages like himself who have been created, who are themselves coming to grips with their own mortality, coming to accept the fact that one day they will stop, that they won't be made anymore, that they won't continue, that everything we have is finite. That's some deep, dark themes. But the game's ultimate message is one of hope. Who cares if this isn't the future? This is brilliant in the moment. Zidane's story is about the joy of living, about the excitement of adventure, and kidnapping Garnet was just the trigger that he needed to turn his life around. As the third game on the third console generation, the ninth game in the Final Fantasy series overall, this is a fantastic way to look at what the series have been doing to this point. I don't think Final Fantasy IX ever quite reaches the peaks of Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII, but it arguably is just a stronger package overall, and it's got some of its own wonderful selling points that set this above almost any other game in the franchise when it comes to the cast of characters. The franchise would never be this gloriously weird again. It would never be this traditional. It would never be this prepared to just build on what had come before. Looking back at this franchise, it's a series that constantly wants to reinvent, constantly wants to innovate, constantly wants to take risks and experiment, and I applaud that. I'm not saying that Final Fantasy IX doesn't do that. It's not that it doesn't risk, it's not that it doesn't innovate, but it builds upon the strengths of the series as a whole. It builds upon all of the things the team had learned and just focuses on telling a fantastic story with a very stable and solid JRPG turn-based combat mechanic. You couldn't ask for a more polished experience. Just like Final Fantasy VI on the previous console generation and Final Fantasy III on the one before that, they just stick with what works and focus on making that as good as they possibly can. If you've been introduced to the Final Fantasy series purely on the more recent games, which are much more action heavy, and you're looking back to the past, a lot of people would recommend Final Fantasy I as the starting point, or Final Fantasy VII as the epic main point of the series. Final Fantasy X, the game that followed this, the PlayStation 2, the most successful video game console in history. Final Fantasy X was the JRPG selling piece, tentpole release for that console. Or Final Fantasy VI, which is one of the most beloved games in the series. All of these games are great and they're lauded and loved by their fans for a very good reason. All of those are really strong selling points, and there's a good reason why you should turn for all of them. But truthfully, if you want to know what Final Fantasy was like in the old days, it was never more like Final Fantasy than Final Fantasy IX.